Thanks very much, Stuart, and hi everyone. Thanks very much for asking me to speak tonight. I feel something of a fraud since we've just heard from two people with direct experience of Palestine. I'll explain perhaps at the end of this talk why I think it's important for people like me to be involved in the Solidarity campaign. And I'd also just like to begin by, like the others, acknowledging that we're meeting on stolen land. It was very moving and important, I think, at the Nakba rally that happened on Tuesday night to see the numerous expressions of solidarity with Aboriginal people that were offered from the platform, including by a survivor of the 48 Nakba itself. Okay, so Nahed in particular has told us about the figures. At least 111 people have now been gunned down at the Gaza boundary since March the 30th, including 60 on Monday, as well as those assassinations, almost 3,600. Overwhelmingly peaceful Palestinian protesters have been deliberately shot, in many cases necessitating amputations, and the assailants are snipers from what Israeli propagandists unbelievably call the most moral army in the world. Almost 13,000 people have been injured. And I could give other figures, but numbers I think are clinical, and they risk anaesthetising us from the horror of what we've been witnessing, which is a pathological, cold-blooded frenzy of killing. Graves have been dug for journalists, for children, including an eight-month-old baby, and for an amputee in a wheelchair. Israel behaves like a nation-sized version of a US high school shooter, but one who, after the first massacre, is allowed to keep on coming back again and again to exactly the same classrooms, to take aim again and again, always rearmed with deadly new weapons. And until this Tuesday, the Australian government had offered no reaction whatsoever to this weeks-long killing spree. Last week, the Greens' Janet Rice had advocated to a largely empty Senate that Australia recognise the state of Palestine, impose an arms trade embargo on Israel till the occupation and settlements stop, and call on Israel to end its killing of protesters. From the government and the opposition, though, there was absolutely nothing. No declaration of Je suis Gaza, no indication that, as far as the government was concerned, events on the Gaza boundary needed to be treated as anything other than business as usual. Our ambassador in Israel itself, Chris Cannon, had plenty to say during this period about Israeli tech companies, the Jerusalem Literary Festival, and Israel's participation in the Eurovision Song Contest, but not a single word about the ongoing slaughter of Palestinians. On April 26th, after 4 Fridays of protests with 40 Palestinians already killed and 5,500 wounded, Cannon did actually tweet his sympathy after the drowning of 10 Israeli high school students on a school excursion. When he finally did say something on Twitter about Gaza after the Monday carnage, it was simply to pass on Julie Bishop's statement in which she declares that Israel has legitimate security concerns and needs to protect its population, urges Palestinian protesters to refrain from violence and attempting to enter Israeli territory, and calls on Israel to be proportionate in its response and refrain from excessive use of force. So maybe we should just pause a minute to let that sink in. A modern army, with its armour-plated soldiers, its ability to rain laser-guided missiles down on targets at very short notice, trains modern sniper rifles on a crowd of protesters that includes children and people in wheelchairs. And actually, I say protesters. I shouldn't actually say that, I don't think, because unambiguous footage shows very clearly that the IDF is prepared to gun down people who are in no relevant sense protesting. People who are just walking on their own or who are motionless near the Gaza fence. You can look at the footage for yourself on the side of the Independent newspaper from the UK, for example. Just by being there without manifesting any political, overt behaviour whatsoever is enough to get you a bullet through the heart from the IDF in some circumstances. In circumstances like that, it's remarkable, isn't it, that Bishop urges the protesters to refrain from violence and presents the protesters as a threat. She called on the IDF not to use excessive force. Apparently then, she must think that some force is okay. At what point, I wonder, do Palestinian deaths start counting as excessive for Bishop? Not once in her media release on Tuesday did she fault Israel for the 58 dead on the previous day. All she did was to urge Israel not to use excessive force in the future. She could, like the New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, have criticised Israel for perpetrating a, quote, devastating one-sided loss of life. She could, like Ardern again, have condemned the violence that has occurred. She could also, again, like the New Zealand Prime Minister, have called in the Israeli ambassador. She didn't do any of those things. For all we can conclude, Bishop is relaxed and comfortable with the death toll thus far, as long as Israel assures us that it's not going to be excessive down the track. Now, as we know, Bishop is only the foreign minister. To reach peak moral bankruptcy, you had to go up to prime ministerial level. Faced with the death of 58 protesters, Turnbull was widely quoted, including in Israel, parroting the cynical line defended by the US, that the deaths were Hamas's fault, Hamas's, because of their confrontational conduct and because they were seeking to provoke the IDF. And no doubt that plays well in a sector of Turnbull's electorate just over there in Wentworth with its high proportion of Zionist voters. It goes without saying, unfortunately, that the ALP was no better. True to its long-standing record on refugees, Indigenous justice, workers' rights, and the list goes on, it's also highly reactionary on Palestine. Shorten told the media that both sides should de-escalate the situation, setting up a moral equivalence between Israelis and Palestinians, as though Israelis, who, remember, have suffered 0 casualties since March 30, were victims as well. Penny Wong declared that occupied East Jerusalem is actually contested, thereby suggesting that the UN perhaps hadn't clearly recognised East Jerusalem as Palestinian territory. The best statement, as usual, came from the Greens' Lee Rhiannon. I won't read her statement, but she didn't find it necessary to engage in the ritual insistence that Israel and Australia are best friends, like her colleague Janet Rice had told the Senate last week in an otherwise excellent speech. But what Rice hadn't explained was why Australia needs to be a friend of Israel at all, let alone best friends. The real explanation, solidarity among vicious settler colonial states, isn't one that any progressive like Rice should endorse.
Very good.
Now, on his visit here last year, Netanyahu said, echoing Tony Abbott, that there's no better friend than Australia for the state of Israel. He wasn't greatly exaggerating. Australia's UN voting record alone shows unwavering support for Israel, placing us in what Jake Lynch, who I think might not be here anymore, oh, he is there. Okay, there you are, Jake. Your phrase, the extreme fringe of world opinion on the issue, is exactly the right one. Let's hope not. And if you want the details of Australia's dismal and shameful voting record on Israel, I refer you to an article that came out in New Matilda by me the other day, where you can go through the dispiriting and shameful story blow by blow. When they're criticised on our record, Australian politicians often fall back on the stock claim that the Middle East is complicated. It's the same defence that Zionists themselves are quick to jump to when they want to justify Israel's crimes. The Palestine question is just so complex, we're told, and the clear subtext is that unless you're an expert, you simply don't have the right to venture an opinion on the subject. Now, that reactionary mystification, in my view, serves one purpose only: to quarantine Israel from the condemnation of public opinion. The idea that Israel-Palestine is somehow different from other questions of world politics, the idea that you can very well have a view on what's happening in the US or Myanmar, or for that matter, Tibet, but that Israel is just too hard, is one of the strategies that Zionists use to discredit criticism. And we need to reject that notion. We need to reject the notion that politics in that part of the world has the unique characteristic of somehow being beyond human comprehension. Many well-informed expert analysts, people like Gideon Levy or Randa Abdel Fattah, tell us the exact opposite, that actually the situation is perfectly simple enough, that Palestinian testimony has been showing us for years exactly what's going on, and that as a result, you don't need to have studied or even visited the Middle East, as I haven't, for decades to be able to take a side. And certainly the fundamental consideration about Israel-Palestine politics surely couldn't be simpler. The fact that there isn't one single place built in Israel that didn't have a former Arab population. And that's not me saying it. It's not even a Palestine supporter. It's a quotation from Moshe Dayan, the Israeli general and former defence and foreign ministers, in a lecture that he gave in Israel in 1969. Now, complexity isn't the only ideological mechanism which Zionists appeal to in order to secure passivism and suppress activism over Palestine in the West. Another one, I think, is pessimism. And liberal Zionists are frequently telling us how pessimistic they are about peace, how much they want peace, but how desperately pessimistic they are that it's attainable. Philip Mendez and Nick Dyrenfurth, particular friends of Peter's over there, do so in their 2015 anti-BDS tract, Boycotting Israel is Wrong. They tell us, quote, highly pessimistic about the chances of a peace deal being struck in the near future. That's page 146 if you're interested. Mark Baker said something very similar just a few weeks ago at the Sydney Writers' Festival. We just need to hear much, much less from liberal Zionists about how depressed and pessimistic they are, and much, much more about the urgency of justice for Palestine. No one should care about Zionists' depression or pessimism. The main effect of their articulating it is to sap their audience of any commitment to acting for change or any perception or understanding of its attainability. Pessimism and depression are infectious, and they lead inexorably in one direction, right back to the status quo. On the surface, liberal Zionists may lament the fact, and I'm sure they're sincere in many cases, that progress in Israel seems unlikely. But the effect of their hand-wringing is to deliver exactly the same message as Netanyahu, who they claim to oppose entirely. And that message is nothing is going to change, Palestinian resistance is futile. No one thinks, of course, that peace can be forged overnight. But rather than proclaim their pessimism, anyone who really cares about peace in Palestine-Israel should embrace the currently most promising tactic of the Palestine Solidarity Movement, the boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign. And in the last few months, BDS has accelerated remarkably, especially on the cultural front, with figures as diverse as the New Zealand singer Lord, Paul McCartney, the famous French cineast Jean-Luc Godard, Natalie Portman, severing ties with Israel. They might not have admitted that that's what they were doing. The fact is that that's exactly what they were doing. The recent victory of Israel in the Eurovision Song Contest offers the BDS movement a very important opportunity. In Australia, BDS efforts have recently been scaled up. Following a large BDS conference at Sydney University last year, the first Australian National BDS Committee has been constituted. A number of members of it are here tonight, and it's busy working on campaigns. Boycott activities, of course, aren't new in this country, and they've been far from unsuccessful so far. But the new committee hopefully will give Australia a national BDS strategy and coordination, and there's every reason to hope that boycott activity here will be significantly boosted. Stuart, how much longer have I got?
No.
I'm almost done.
No, fine.
I am almost done, but I've got a couple of paragraphs if that's okay with people. So that's BDS. And I mean, I'd just like to, I suppose, mention specifically the academic boycott, which is something I'm directly involved in. At the University of Sydney, we now have 57 members of academic staff and postgraduate students explicitly committing to sever ties with Israel. That has been going up ever since the petition was first launched. The campaign is slowly becoming national. At the University of Wollongong, there are now 32 signatures on an identical BDS pledge, and we're talking to people on many other campuses about how to scale up the academic boycott campaign in this country. So I spoke about pessimism and complexity as ultimately distractions that dampen activism. And there's one last one that I'd like to end by discussing, and it is actually the idea that moral bankruptcy is ultimately to blame for the situation, whether that's the moral bankruptcy of Netanyahu, of Hamas, of Trump, or of Turnbull. Don't get me wrong, I'm the first to denounce these people as morally bankrupt. They actually are, and it's important that we say so. But I think Palestine supporters and others say so too much when they should be saying other things. In Forbes on Nakba Day, John Zogby called the Trump administration's actions immoral. A Haaretz headline earlier this week condemned America's immoral support for Israel's alt-right government. Writing for the New Yorker, in a pretty disgraceful piece, I thought Bernard Avishai somehow managed to find it immoral under the shadow of today's deaths for Hamas's leaders to continue to promote a Palestinian return to Israel. So whether from the right or the left, the reading of Israel-Palestine politics through a moral lens is a recurrent feature of the discourse about it. Ultimately, I think it's important for us to understand structural issues of racism and colonialism, like the ones that we see in the Middle East, in more political terms than in moral ones. Ultimately, I don't think progressives should be too interested in distributing moral brownie points to politicians. Framing political choices as moral or as immoral suggests that the road to policy change could come from a personal moral realisation, a change of heart. If the central fact about the global politics of Palestine is Western politicians' moral bankruptcy, then that suggests that Palestine supporters have to win an argument with MPs, one by one, about what's right and wrong. Lead Trump, in other words, down his road to Damascus, where he'll experience a blinding moral epiphany. That way of thinking simply writes out the public, and it sees political change as the result of the powerful moral appeals of astute political insiders, not the result of pressure from below. Now, don't get me wrong, I think there is a place for political lobbying. I don't want to exclude that entirely, but good luck with making a moral appeal to Trump. It's obvious that Trump is immune to that kind of consideration, surely, but ultimately, so are Theresa May, Emmanuel Macron, Malcolm Turnbull, Bill Shorten. Support for Israel strongly unites the Anglo and to a lesser extent, but still an extent, the Western political establishment. The intense opposition that Corbyn has encountered in the UK for his overt pro-Palestinianism is all the evidence that we need for that proposition. In the echo chamber of opportunism and ruling class interest that are Westminster, Washington, the Elysee Palace and Canberra, politics is about pressure, not about moral argument. If we want to make a moral argument, let's by all means do so, but let's not mainly address it to the career politicians from the major parties whose inability or unwillingness to heed it couldn't be clearer, whether that's on Indigenous justice, climate change, the rights of working people, or any of the other issues on which mainstream politicians' ability to actually act decisively for progress has been, utterly, I would have thought, demonstrated. Rather than lobbying politicians behind closed doors to prompt an epiphany that either will never happen or, if it did happen, will not be enough to effect change, Palestine supporters, I'd suggest, should mostly be making an open public appeal for solidarity with Palestine through BDS. I'm not saying don't lobby politicians at all. I'm saying let's concentrate on the open public BDS campaign, because it seems to me that it's that, not appeals to politicians' better consciences, that seems to me to be what will generate useful political pressure on this supremely important issue of international solidarity. Thanks.